So thank you very much, Professor Dash, for that incredibly generous introduction. And unfortunately, I don't think I'm as young as you've made me out to be. Yes. But there are still younger people who are doing history of science here. So that is always heartening. Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. Thank you also to Professor Deepak Kumar, who has been an inspiration and a mentor for multiple generations of us now, and especially at my old alma mater, JNU. Thank you also to Shubho and Professor Ahmed for organizing this and for inviting me. One of the things that I thought I could do with this keynote is very briefly, Deepak mentioned that history of science is a very old thing in a sense. That it goes back to the 19th century, right to the beginning of the time when science itself was being invented out of natural philosophy. But yet we have a new beginning now as well. So this travel between old and new, what is new? I could probably talk a little about that. So what is new in the new histories of science? So I spent the last 20 odd years teaching abroad, and then I only came back again to India recently. And one of the things I've seen is that there's a big divide between the way history of science is done in separate history of science departments that exist in, say, the UK or the US or in Australia or Canada or Germany, and the way, because here we usually don't have history of science departments. It's part of mainstream history departments. And so there are some differences, and I was thinking that maybe I could talk about that a bit. So one of the things that the new history of science does is that it definitely goes beyond chronology. So a lot of the older history of science is basically a chronology of who discovered what when. And thanks to our love of multiple choice questions in this country, we have further cemented that idea of history, that it's just knowing the right date and the right name for the right discovery. But what new history of science tries to do is to go beyond that idea that it's merely a list of dates. And it does this by talking of something called the symmetry principle. Now, the symmetry principle, what it does is that before this, there was an idea that you're going from science goes from ignorance to further enlightenment gradually. But in that, inbuilt in that is a certain value judgment. You think people in the past were less enlightened than you are, that people today who are thought to be unscientific are somehow have views that are less legitimate or that are less defensible. That kind of implication of stupidity to our ancestors is a little disrespectful. And I think what the symmetry principle does is, instead of looking back from the present, it tries to look forward from their time. Why was it that these theories that seem absurd to us today seemed convincing to them? What were the grounds on which they were able to believe in things which today seems like, oh, this is absolutely irrational. So what was the rationality of that time? Rather than thinking that our position of rationality is the only rationality, trying to think from backwards to forwards rather than forwards to backwards. So that's the basic thing about symmetry principle. And what it also does then is it makes us rethink the idea of discovery. The moments of discovery that we so celebrated in the traditional history of science meant that, again, we thought that truth was out there, somebody found it, and the moment it was found, that was the moment of discovery. Again, from lack of knowledge to knowledge. Whereas what the new history of science suggests is that we think of, if you go back to that period, why were people thinking in one way and why did one person think differently? So instead of thinking that everybody else was stupid and one person stumbled on the truth, you think of, okay, something changed, something that made this one person see something that other people weren't seeing. And then you try to build forward from there. So you think of discovery not as this accidental eureka moment, but rather within its larger setting of historical time, of culture, etc. And this is what has led us to what is today being often called the materialist turn. The best way to explain this materialist turn is, I think, to distinguish between natural objects and working objects, as many historians of science these days do in the West. Particularly this very, very well-cited book, which is a history of objectivity itself. Like what does it mean to be objective? How does one become objective? That also has a history. It's not always that there were objective people and somehow unobjective people, but objectivity has its own history. And in that, Peter Gallison and Lorraine Daston make this distinction. What they say is that we know science studies nature. It studies natural objects. But it doesn't study every single object. Whenever, say, I'm a botanist, I want to study a particular plant. I don't go out and study every single plant that has ever existed. That is impossible. I choose a particular species, then I take a particular type sample or a group of samples, and I bring that back to my laboratory or to my herbarium or to my botanical garden, and there I study that particular sample. There are several other individual plants of that same species, which does not get looked at. That's impossible for any human being to do. You take one instance, one working sample, type specimen, something, and you work from that. You create a generalization from that. Now, the scientist's job is to erase the specificities of that sample and produce an universal conclusion. The historian's job is to go back and see how that universal conclusion was still subject to this particular sample. So what is the particularity of the sample? Where did the person get the plant from? Who took him to that place? Who then helped her recognize the plant? All these things have become interesting questions for us. So we don't just think of the botanical classification, we think of, okay, did they buy it in a bazaar or did they find it in a jungle? If they found it in a jungle, how did they get there? Who was driving the car that got there? Was there a road? Did they need a guide? Did they talk to some local people and ask them where to find the thing? And how has that particularity then shaped the general conclusion? So, as the quote here says, that the definition of a working object, which is what they're calling this kind of particular case or case study or whatever you want to call it, is any manageable communal representative of the sector of nature under investigation. So whatever, it can be one piece of rock. If you're a geologist, it could be one measurement of an oceanic temperature. If you're studying climate change, whatever your specific thing is, that is called a working object. So, okay. So what does this do for us? Let me try and, this is a lot of big talk and big ideas, but how does it play out? So I want to go back to one of the best known names in our traditional history of science, Jagadish Chandra Bosu, who also appears on the poster, of course, of this event today. So Jagadish Bosu has been much written about. I mean, there are great books like Patrick Geddes' original biography, which is a fantastic read, trying to think of Jagadish Bosu's science as a new type of science, something distinctive about it. Then Ashish Nandi very famously called him one of the proponents of an alternative science. So he has had, and we can go to the next one. And not only that, he's now become a bit of a cottage industry. Practically every year there are 2 or 3 new books on Jagadish Chandra Bosu. I doubt whether they have much new to contribute to the scholarship, but they're being published like there's no tomorrow. And including an Amar Chitra Katha comic. But what you will notice on all of this is there's no talk of, very few people today would know how did Jagadish Bosu get to the conclusions he did. What were we might know that he was very good at crafting machines, but we don't know exactly what the instruments were. We know that he said something about plants and their lives, but we don't know what plant he studied usually. And in none of these covers will you see, there are sometimes he's shown with a pen in one, there are some instruments on one cover, but practically none apart from the comic book has a plant on the cover. And the plant it has is the wrong plant. Because this is not, it looks like a hibiscus, which is not what he studied. So, you can go to the next one. Instead, one contemporary illustration by Gaganendranath Thakur, and Gagan Thakur drew quite a few interesting images of Jagadish Bosu. But if you see this one, which I really love, you see how Jagadish Bosu is actually in the background. He's hiding behind the hill, as it were. And it's all these plants, and these are actually the plants that they did study. So there's the mimosa or Lojjabati Lata, which is right at the front. This one is called Boncharal. It's in English. It's called, I think, telegraph plant. I forget what the Latin name is. So, and these are there's the frog, of course. These were his working objects, or these were the classes of working objects that he was working with. This was, and so I think in a sense, Gagan Thakur kind of gets it right more than the historians do at this point by forestaging these. But okay, what can we get out of it if we go back, if we take this seriously, if we take the Lojjabati Lata seriously or the Boncharal seriously, what can we get from that? So one of the things we keep hearing about, whenever you read any of Jagadish Bose wrote quite a bit in English, of course, but also substantially in Bangla. Others around him wrote. One of the most informative is often Gopal Chandra Bhattacharya, who wrote a very famous book called Banglar Gachpala. But Gopal Bhattacharya was also a protege of Jagadish Bose. Jagadish Bose has discovered him when he was languishing in some small village school after reading an article he had written on plants in the journal Probashi, and brought him to the Bose Institute and given him a job there. And he then goes on to have a pretty successful scientific career. He also says, whenever they write about Jagadish Bose, they say that, well, he worked with the Lojjabati Lata, and if you know the Lojjabati Lata, you will know that it's very obvious to see that if you touch it, it reacts, there's a response, and then you kind of work forward from that. That you ask the question, was it specific to this plant, or were there other plants that also had this same characteristic? But they also say that it is Sarbojono Vidhito or Bohul Porichito, which means everybody knows this in Bengal. It is not a matter of discovery. If you're, nowadays I don't know because we all live in flats and there's very, very few plants unless they're potted in our balconies. But most people at that time would have encountered the Lojjabati Lata all around them. It is usually, it grows in villages pretty widely. So most people, and that's why they keep on saying that everybody knows this. There's nothing to explain. So there is no light bulb moment about the Lojjabati Lata. Nobody is telling you, including Jagadish Bose, that, oh, this is how I thought I will use the Lojjabati Lata as an experimental device. Because it's like, what's the point? Everybody knows this thing. So that is what he keeps on, talking about. So, okay. But why is the Lojjabati Lata everywhere? Why does it grow so much around this thing in villages? Why is it allowed to? Because there are lots of weeds and unwanted plants that are cleared out. When you have a human habitation, we clear away the plants we don't want. But Lojjabati Lata is quite widely found all over this thing, all over India's. And at least in Bengali villages, it's quite common. So why is it so common? So one reason is that there are a lot of religious beliefs around the Lojjabati Lata. One of it is that if you allow it to grow around your house, it will prevent the so-called evil eye. Or it is thought to be, some say that Shoni, the god Saturn, lives in it. Some say that it keeps him away. But whatever it is, you don't want Saturn in your house. So you put these plants around your house and that keeps him away. And so it's allowed to grow as a wild weed all around this thing. And this is not a new idea. I've taken this image off the internet. But here is William Crookes, the famous colonial ethnographer, in his folklore of northern India, mentioning a quote from Bishop Heber in the 1830s. So right at that moment when that first History of Science article was being written, we have Bishop Heber telling us how the mimosa has this idea that it's a pervasive idea that people think it preserves you against magic, it avoids the evil eye. So he interprets it in a particular way, but he documents this belief in 1830s, that there is a widespread folk belief around mimosa, and which is why villagers actually encourage the mimosa to grow. So he says, I asked a villager that, why don't you cut this down? And he's like, no, this is a noble plant, you should have it around you. So the reason it is there in the villages are a set of completely so-called irrational, religious and astrological or whatever you want to call it, superstitious beliefs. But precisely because it is there, every little Bengali child also knows it when they're growing up. They might not know all the folk beliefs around it, but they encounter the plant all the time. And that's why by the time Jagadish Bose comes to the point where he's thinking about these questions, it's an obvious choice for him to think about this through this plant. And not only that, we also know again from Gopal Chandra Bhattacharya that naturally in villages it was people would, especially younger kids, would play with these plants. They would often, so Gopal Bhattacharya says, for instance, that whenever you see there's a big crop of these plants growing in somewhere, you throw a pebble at it or you throw a stone at it, and then all of them close. And suddenly there's a dramatic effect, as if it's a theater that shuts down. So that whole idea is, again, so you go from having an irrational belief that is creating a context for plants to grow, to a point where, what irrational I'm putting within quotes because I don't want to judge this. I'm just saying that there are a set of beliefs because of which this plant has been allowed around human habitations. It has grown. And once it has grown, then you have young kids who encounter it. When they encounter it, this is an interesting plant. It's all around you. You play with it because you touch it and it shuts. And you have many different types of Lojjapati Lata, by the way. You have the Sthal Lojjapati, the Jol Lojjapati, you have Gach Lojjapati, and you have different games with it. So when there's a big forest, you throw a pebble at it, and the whole thing suddenly shuts down. And it looks magical. And of course, young boys constantly throw stones at it. So that's again something that's documented. So you go from something that looks like magic to something that looks like play. And we are not at science yet, but we are still with Lojjapati. But then also that, okay, it was there, it was growing, it was there because of these beliefs, and boys learnt about it, but many people learnt about it. There were lots of trees, lots of other plants also. It's not as if this was the only plant. So why does Jagadish Bose, or how does he zero in on this plant? He could have got interested in some other question, maybe not response, some other question, and gone with some other plant. So what is it about this plant? Well, and that I think goes back to this gentleman, Hemchandra Banerjee or Hemchandra Bandyopadhyay, who's probably not as well known today, but he was in the 19th century, he was probably the best known poet for a very long time. And he was thought to be, even in the early 20th century, he was still being thought of as perhaps second only to Michael Madhusudan in terms of his this thing. And it's to his poetry that a lot of early nationalist thinking went back. And he, in 1870, he produces a book called Kobita Boli. This is the third edition. This is not the first edition. And the first edition has been lost since the early 20th century. So people haven't actually located it. And thanks to this gentleman, Bhudev Mukhopadhyay, who was, again, a very famous 19th century intellectual figure who worked in the education department, he got some of those poems included in school texts as prescribed texts for people, children who were studying in school. So Bidyalaya Pattho was, so some of the poems were extracted from Kobita Boli and made into a book called Bidyalaya Pattho, which was then read in colonial schools. In those, in that 1870 Kobita Boli already, one of the most famous poems which Ramendra Sundar Trivedi later on, again an eminent scientist, a physicist, would say was one of his most favorite poems, was called Lojjapati Lata. And we can go. So I won't read this out, but if you read this is basically the first two stanzas is a poem on the Lojjapati Lata, that you're everywhere, you're all around us, we neglect you because you grow in corners, but the moment I touch you, you kind of shrink out of shame or lojja or embarrassment. And then in the final this thing, because Hemchandra Banerjee is also very close to Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. He's interested in widow remarriage and women's reform and social reform agenda. So he connects the last paragraph, he connects it to nationalism, he connects it to the plight of marginalized human beings, particularly women, but also men who are being ignored because they're shrinking, they're not speaking up, and people are not giving them their due. So this poem then becomes a kind of nationalist rallying call. But the poem is actually about the plant as well. And so this aesthetic and the political are getting stitched together here in the minds of these young boys and girls, mostly boys at that point, who are going to school. So Jagadish Bose would have read this poem at school. He would have probably written exams about this poem way before, and he would have, and that would have then again probably made him take another look at the plants that was growing around his house, which he was playing with anyways, I'm sure. And then from there, it's only a small step to then think of, which he says in his own writings. I'm not making this up, that it's, everybody knows this stuff, and you know that the Lajjavati Lata reacts, but what I wanted to see is, was it an atypical plant, or did other plants also react like this? But then he experiments with it, he finds out with his that it moves not by just mechanical means, but you can apply electricity to it, and that triggers a response, and that then makes him study frogs, and he sees that that same thing happens in other plants that don't visibly shrink as well. So then what does this different history tell us? So if you look at the traditional narrative of history of science, it is about the discovery, a moment of sudden discovery with no background almost, that somebody, there's an individual genius, that person suddenly discovered some new truth that everybody else had somehow been ignorant about, and then creates an universal conclusion that is totally applicable everywhere, to all plants, to all, in every place and time. It also tells the story as one of going from superstition or irrationality towards this kind of linear progression from superstition and irrationality to rational discovery, to the coming into light, a kind of very evangelical move almost, that they were ignorant and then they saw the light of God and became enlightened. And art and science remain different. Okay, artists might draw about scientists, but there's nothing there's no direct traffic between them. These are totally different things. And finally, in the traditional narrative, what you'll get is a version of history of science that is solely almost focused on the scientists themselves. It talks about, okay, this is what this scientist did, this is what the people before him or her did, this is what they did afterwards. So those books and those articles, the number of characters there are very limited, and they're all scientists. What does the new narrative do? Well, it looks at local circumstances as being crucial to producing universal discoveries. So local circumstances as crucial to the conception of a new idea. How does that new idea come about? And how is the experimental design then created to prove that idea? Both are contingent on a particular, very historically specific set of factors that are quite local, and it tries to bring out that local aspect of it. It also looks at symbolic beliefs that shapes, so like I mentioned a set of symbolic beliefs around, say, astrology, around religion, around I don't know what to call it, but if you want to call it superstition, that whole set of symbolic beliefs we saw shaped the domestic space, shaped the everyday space. Again, space is something that is often written out of these traditional narratives, because it's so driven by abstract ideas that entire history of science is imagined as these like abstract ideas that are not in place, that are not related to very material circumstances. So if you think of the space, what is the domestic space in which, not even the laboratory, I'm taking it a step back, what is the kind of household space in which this person grew up? What would he have seen around him? How would he have known it? This is the primary context in which somebody like Jagadish Bose gets exposed to particular plants. When he's growing up, it's at home, way before he's become a scientist, that he's seeing certain plants, he's learning about them, he's seeing how they behave. And it goes from there. It also looks at how aesthetic education, so the fact that he read this poem might have focused his attention on a particular plant. And that aesthetic here includes the political as well, because there was, and in fact, not about Lojjabati Lata, but about a different plant. There was a poem that Hemchandra Bandyopadhyay had written, and that was included again by Bhudeb in the Education Gazette, that got both of them into trouble with the government, because the colonial government didn't like it, that this has too many nationalist connotations here, this is not good. So, the aesthetic and the political is getting into the education system, but it's also, this is something we are not even thinking of when we are thinking of how is scientific progress or how are scientific discoveries happening. But that might have actually had a more intimate connection. What he was reading in poetry, in novels. We can do a much more deeper dive into any figure like Jagadish Bose and see what else were they reading. No scientist just reads science books. They read other things as well, especially before they become scientists. Afterwards, maybe, particularly these days, there's no time to read anything else. But before that, they read a lot. And that shapes them, shapes what they're interested in, how they look at the world, etc. So, history of science here in this new version, what it does is it looks at the location of science, it tries to locate science itself. The scientists are interested in the universal. They're not interested in the location in which the truth was produced. But the historian's job is to relocate science, to put it back in its context. Contextualization is what we do. And that context includes the material context, what plants were around them, the cultural context of why were those plants around them, the literary contexts of what may have shaped their view of what was around them. So, okay, I will leave it at that. So thank you very much for this opportunity.